The fluorescent light above the conference table flickered twice before it steadied, and in that brief stuttering darkness I saw Hung's face clearly for the first time in years. Not the face he showed at family dinners, the wide smile, and the loud laugh, and the hand that clapped shoulders too hard. This was the other face, the one underneath. "You never understood money anyway," he said, and his voice carried across the room the way a stone carries across still water, not loud, but reaching every corner before anyone could stop it. "That's why your husband kept you in the back room counting other people's numbers. Sign here, sister, and be grateful we're giving you anything at all." The room held 8 people. 2 officials from the ward office sat at the far end of the table, their folders open, their pens ready. Ba Tu from next door had come as my witness, her small hands folded in her lap. Kun, my son, was still on a train from Hanoi. I had told him not to rush. The remaining 3 were Hung's people, men I recognized from his circle of buyers and sellers, men who spoke about land the way other men spoke about weather, casually, as if the ground beneath someone's home were simply atmosphere. They were all watching me. I smiled. Not the polite smile I had learned to wear at my husband's family gatherings, the one that sat just below my eyes and never quite reached them. This was something quieter, something I had not shown anyone in this room before. I picked up the pen. I set it back down. I folded my hands on top of my old brown handbag, the one with the brass clasp that Min had bought me the year the textile factory promoted me to chief accountant, and I said nothing at all. Hung blinked. He had expected tears, or argument, or the trembling protest of an old woman who did not understand the paperwork in front of her. He had not expected silence. People rarely know what to do with a woman who simply watches them, who holds their words in her eyes like water held in a still cup. I watched him recalibrate. I had spent 30 years reading faces across balance sheets. I knew exactly what his expression meant. He thought he had won. He would think that for a little while longer. That was fine. I had time. Let me go back. Let me tell you how a room like that comes to exist at all. How a table full of papers and officials and a dead man's younger brother can become the place where someone tries to erase you with a signature. Min died 3 years ago, on a Thursday in March, when the rain had been falling since before dawn. He went quietly, the way he had done most things, without dramatics, without a long goodbye speech, just a gradual loosening of the grip he had on the world until one morning the grip was gone. I sat with him through the night. I held his hand until it was cold. Then I opened all the windows, the way my mother had taught me, so that whatever was still him could find its way out of the house and not be trapped inside the walls. His family came for the funeral. They came in numbers. The cousins and the uncles and the in-laws I had cooked for and served tea to for 40 years. They stood at the altar in front of his photograph and burned incense and wept, and then they went home, and the house went quiet again. And I became, in the eyes of most of them, simply the widow, the woman left behind, the remnant. Hung had always been the ambitious one. Min used to say it gently, the way you describe a quality in someone you love that you also do not entirely trust. My brother wants everything to happen faster than it should. He was not wrong. Even as boys, Min had told me, Hung used to count the mangoes on the trees in their yard before they were ripe enough to pick, calculating how many he would get before the others took their share. The compensation notice came 14 months after Min died. The city was expanding. A road project, a new boulevard, long planned and long delayed, finally moving forward. Our house sat in the affected zone, along with 11 others on the street. The ward office sent papers. There were meetings. There were numbers on documents with official seals. Hung appeared the week the notices arrived. He came with tea and condolences and a reasonable voice, and he offered to handle things on my behalf. "You're grieving, sister. You shouldn't have to deal with all this paperwork on top of everything else. I'll take care of it. You can trust me." I had smiled at him then, too. I had not trusted him since 1987, when I had caught a small discrepancy in a family transaction that no one else noticed and no one else mentioned. Not a large amount, but enough. Numbers do not lie. They are the only things, in my experience, that never do. I let him handle the meetings. I let him bring me summaries. I let him see an old woman who sat in front of her husband's altar every morning with a cup of tea and a bowl of incense, who moved through her days at the pace of grief, who nodded when he explained things and thanked him for his help. And every evening, after the incense burned down to ash, I opened my notebook. The blue ledger had been with me since the early 1990s, a simple thing, narrow-ruled pages, the kind sold in stationery shops near the textile factory. The cover worn soft at the corners from years of handling. I had filled dozens of its twins with factory accounts, depreciation schedules, wage calculations. This one I had kept blank, waiting. When the compensation process began, I started writing in it, not in a dramatic way, just as I had always worked. Date, source, figure, cross-reference. Every number Hung told me, every figure I overheard at the ward meetings I attended quietly, sitting in the back row in my gray Audi, the one that made me invisible, the one that made people look past me the way they look past furniture. The official notification had been posted publicly, as required by law. A single sheet of paper mounted on the board at the end of the street. Most people walked past it. Most people do not read public notices. They wait for someone to tell them what it says. I read it on a Tuesday morning before 6 o'clock. While the street was still empty and the only sound was the sweep of a neighbor's broom on concrete, I stood in front of that board for a long time. Then I went home, sat down at my husband's desk, the desk where he had kept his engineering blueprints, where the smell of his pencils still lived in the grain of the wood, and I wrote down every number from memory. I had been doing this my whole life. You do not spend 30 years in accounting without training your mind to hold figures the way a jar holds water, sealed and exact. The number Hung had told me was 400 dapel u million dong. The number on the official board was different, significantly different. I made a cup of tea. I sat with that difference for a long time. I looked at my husband's photograph on the altar, the one from the year we were married, when he was wearing his good shirt and his hair was still dark. I lit a fresh stick of incense and watched the smoke rise and curl and disappear into the ceiling. My mother used to say that still water runs deepest. She meant it as a warning and as a comfort, both that the things that don't move on the surface are the things that run strongest underneath, that silence is not emptiness, that patience is not surrender. I understood her then. I had been still water my entire life. I had let the surface stay quiet while everything that mattered moved far below where anyone thought to look. Hung thought he had read me correctly. He had read the surface. He had no idea how deep the current ran. I closed the blue ledger. I picked up my pen, and I began to plan. Min built the altar shelf himself. That is the first thing I want you to understand about the man I married, because it tells you more than any list of his qualities ever could. He was an engineer by training, precise and methodical, a man who could look at a crumbling foundation and tell you within minutes what had failed and why. But when his mother died, the year before we wed, he did not hire anyone to build her a proper place in our home. He went to the lumber yard on Trun Fu Street on a Saturday morning, bought a single plank of jackfruit wood, the old kind, dense and reddish-brown, the kind that holds its shape for decades, and he spent 2 evenings measuring, sanding, fitting, until the shelf sat perfectly level against the north wall of the front room, as solid as anything the city's construction crews had ever built. When I moved in after the wedding, I asked him why jackfruit wood. He looked at me the way he sometimes looked at a structural calculation that had resolved cleanly. Like the answer was obvious, and the question pleased him anyway. Because it lasts, he said. I want something that lasts. For 38 years, that shelf held photographs and incense, and small offerings of fruit and flowers. His mother first, then his father, then, one by one, the others who left before us. I learned to keep the incense fresh, to change the water in the flower vase every other day, to wipe the frames gently with a dry cloth so that the faces stayed clear. It became part of my mornings the way coffee becomes part of a morning not thought about, simply done, the body moving through the ritual before the mind fully wakes. When Min died, I added his photograph to the shelf. I put it at the center. He would have protested, if he could have. He was not a man who liked the center of anything. He preferred the edges, the background, the quiet corner of the room where the work got done without an audience. 40 years in engineering and construction, and I could count on one hand the number of times he had raised his voice at a meeting. He did not need to. He was always the one who actually understood the numbers, and eventually, the room always came around to him. That was something we shared. The patience of people who know that the numbers will prove themselves if you give them time. We were not a romantic couple in the way films describe romance. We did not have dramatic arguments followed by passionate reconciliations. We did not say I love you constantly or perform affection for the benefit of other people. What we had was something quieter and, I believe, more durable. We were two people who had chosen each other with clear eyes, and continued choosing each other every day after that, in the small ways that actually constitute a life. He brought me tea in the mornings. Not always, not on the days when his schedule pulled him out the door before sunrise, but on the days he could. He set it on my desk without announcement, already the right temperature, already with the correct amount of sugar, which was none. He had remembered that since our first year of marriage and never once forgotten. I kept his accounts. Not the official ones, he had people for those, but the personal ones, the family finances, the careful management of what we earned and what we owed and what we were putting aside for Khan's education, for repairs to the house, for the small emergencies that arrive without warning in every life. Min trusted my numbers completely, and without reservation. In 38 years, he never once looked over my shoulder or questioned a figure I had given him. That kind of trust, I have learned, is rarer than most people realize. The house on our street had been in Min's family since before he was born. His parents had built it in the early years after the war, when the city was still reorganizing itself, when land was allocated rather than bought. When people built what they could, with what they had. It was not a large house. 3 rooms on the ground floor, 2 above, a narrow yard in the back with a pomelo tree that gave fruit every autumn whether anyone tended it or not. The walls were thick plaster, slightly uneven, painted a pale yellow that had faded over the decades to something closer to cream. Khan grew up in those rooms. He learned to walk on the tiled floor of the front room, gripping the low bench beside the altar for balance. He did his schoolwork at the kitchen table, where the light came in from the south window in the afternoons. He left at 22 for Hanoi, for an engineering position that suited him. He had inherited that from his father, and built his adult life there, visiting when he could, calling regularly, being the kind of son who remained present even from a distance. After he left, the house became primarily Min's and mine. We had more space than we needed, and we filled it in the way long married people fill space not with things, but with habits. Min's engineering journals in the front room. My ledger books and accounting references on the shelf in the bedroom. The kitchen organized exactly as I had organized it 20 years earlier. Every pot and utensil in the same place. Because when you have found the arrangement that works, there is no reason to change it. The yard in the back was my domain. I am not, by nature, a person who requires beauty in order to function. I have always been more concerned with what is accurate than what is lovely. But the pomelo tree gave me something I did not know I was looking for when I first came to this house as a young wife. It was the same every year. The same blossom smell in spring, white flowers small enough to miss if you were not paying attention. The same heavy green fruit in autumn, sweet and slightly bitter the way good things often are. The same pattern, reliable and unhurried, indifferent to whatever was happening in the rooms inside. I used to take my morning tea in the yard when the weather allowed. After Min died, I continued. Grief changes many things. Routines, if you are careful with them, can hold you in place while everything else shifts. I want to be honest about something, because this story requires honesty to make sense. I knew, even while Min was still alive, that Hung watched our house the way he watched everything that might eventually be convertible into money. I had seen it for years. The slight flicker in his eyes when he visited and walked through the rooms. The questions he asked about property values in our neighborhood. The comments that seemed casual but landed with too much precision to be accidental. Min saw it too. We had spoken of it once, obliquely, in the way married people sometimes speak about uncomfortable things without naming them directly. He means no harm, Min said. And then, after a pause, he would, though, if the opportunity arrived. I had agreed, and I had done what I always did when I identified a risk I could not yet resolve. I noted it. I filed it in the part of my mind that held unresolved figures, the ones that did not yet add up but would, eventually, with enough data. The opportunity Min had spoken of arrived 14 months after the funeral, in the form of a city road expansion and a compensation package, with a number on it that did not match the number I had read on the official board at the end of our street. On the morning of the ward office meeting, I stood in front of Min's photograph for a long time. The incense was fresh. The pomelo I had placed in the offering bowl was from the last harvest of the tree in our yard, small and imperfect and exactly right. I told him what I was about to do. I told him I was sorry it had come to this, that his brother had made it necessary. I told him I had the notebook, and the notebook had everything. Then I picked up the old brown handbag with the brass clasp and went to meet them. That morning I had not yet opened the notebook in front of anyone. I had not yet shown anyone what it contained. All they had seen was an old woman with a quiet smile and a pen she had not used. What I had not told anyone, not even Khan, not even Batu beside me with her folded hands, was that the notebook was not the only thing I had found. There was something else. Something that had been sitting in Min's desk drawer for 3 years. Something I had not understood the significance of until I read the official compensation board a second time, more carefully, on a Wednesday morning in the gray early light. Something with my husband's name on it that should not have existed at all. The ward office smelled like old paper and cigarette smoke, and something underneath both of those things, something I could not name but recognized. The smell of decisions that had already been made before you walk through the door. I had been to this office twice before. Once in 1994, for a residency document. Once in 2019, for paperwork related to Min's retirement benefits. Both times the walls had been the same shade of pale green, institutional and tired, and both times the fluorescent light above the main counter had made everyone look slightly unwell. Some things about government offices do not change regardless of which decade you enter them. Hung was already there when I arrived. He had positioned himself near the counter with the ease of a man who had been in this room recently, who knew which clerk handled which forms, who understood the unofficial geography of the place. He turned when he heard the door, and his expression arranged itself quickly into something warm. "Sister, you came. Good. I was worried the walk would be too much for you in this heat." The heat was 31 degrees. I had walked farther than 3 blocks in worse weather for 40 years. But I smiled and said nothing about that. There was a man with him I had not seen before. Thin, perhaps 45, with the particular posture of someone who has learned to occupy as little space as possible when useful, and considerably more space when necessary. He was introduced to me as Tom, from the ward office's land management division. He shook my hand with the practiced courtesy of a man who shook many hands in the course of a working day, firm enough to seem respectful, brief enough to convey that he had other things to get to. "Your brother-in-law has been very helpful," Tom said. "He's made this process much smoother for everyone involved." I imagined he had. The papers were already spread on the counter. A compensation agreement, 5 pages, dense with the particular language that bureaucratic documents use to say simple things in complicated ways. I had read documents like this for 30 years. I understood every clause. I also understood that the figure on page 3, 480 million dong, typed neatly in the official font, was not the figure I had copied from the public notification board into my blue ledger 10 days earlier, but I did not say that. Not then. I read the document slowly. This was not performance. I genuinely read every line, every footnote, every referenced regulation. Behind me, I was aware of Hung shifting his weight from one foot to the other. Not obviously. Just enough that I could feel it. The slight impatience of a man who has arranged things and would like them to proceed on schedule. Tom offered a pen. I looked at the signature line. My name was already typed beneath it. The place reserved for the rightful landowner's agreement. Clean and official and waiting. "Is there a timeline for this?" I asked. My voice was mild, the voice I used when asking questions I already knew the answer to. Tom glanced at Hung. The glance was brief, a fifth of a second, the kind of communication that happens between people who have rehearsed their parts. "The project timeline requires all signatures by the end of the month," Tom said. "After that, the compensation rates may be subject to adjustment." Adjustment downward, he meant. That was always what adjustment meant in these conversations. Hung leaned slightly toward me. "Sister, it's a fair amount. Better than most of the neighbors are getting. I've made sure of that. You can trust me on this." I looked at him for a moment. I thought about the pomelo tree in my yard. I thought about Min's hands, how they had looked on the last morning, and how they had looked 40 years earlier when he built the altar shelf, steady and certain, and unaware of what they were building for. I set down the pen. I need a few more days, I said, to go through it properly. You understand. Hung's expression did not collapse. I will give him that. He was practiced enough to hold it together, to keep the warmth on his face even as something behind his eyes made a quick, quiet recalculation. Of course, he said. Of course, sister. Take your time. He came to the house 3 days later. This surprised me slightly. I had expected a phone call, or perhaps another visit to the ward office. Not him standing at my front door at 10 in the morning with a bag of oranges and the particular energy of a man who has decided to move more quickly than originally planned. I let him in. I made tea. We sat in the front room, in the chairs near the window, and the incense on Min's altar sent its thin line of smoke toward the ceiling between us. He talked for 20 minutes about the road project, about the city's expansion plans, about how the neighborhood would change, and how the compensation was actually quite generous when you factored in the current market conditions and the state of the house, which he described as aging, said with a gentleness that was almost more insulting than directness would have been. He talked about Khan, how busy Khan must be in Hanoi, how it would be a burden to ask him to come all this way for administrative paperwork. He talked about me, my health, my comfort, the difficulty of managing property matters alone at my age. I poured tea, I listened. Then he took a document from the inner pocket of his jacket and set it on the table between us. It was not the compensation agreement, it was something else. A one-page form, already filled in, requesting that Hung be designated as the authorized representative for all matters related to the compensation process for the property at our address. At the bottom was a signature line. Just a formality, he said, so I can handle the follow-up documents without bothering you every time. You won't have to come to the office again. Everything goes through me, and I bring you the results. The incense smoke had reached the ceiling and dissolved. I looked at the form. I looked at the signature line. I looked at my husband's photograph on the shelf. At the face he had held at 53, the year that photograph was taken, still dark-haired and slightly squinting because he had always squinted in photographs, as if the camera were a calculation he was trying to work out. I picked up the pen he offered me, and then I stopped. Something had snagged. A small thing, the kind of thing that would mean nothing to most people. At the top of the form, in the reference number line, there was a code, a ward office reference code, the kind assigned when a file is opened. I had seen these codes on the compensation agreement at the office 3 days ago. I had a very good memory for numbers. This code was different. Not dramatically different. One digit altered, near the end. The kind of difference that could be a typo, a clerical error, nothing. The kind of difference that, if you were not the sort of person who spent 30 years cross-referencing figures and had long ago trained yourself to notice when a number did not match its pair, you would never catch. I set the pen down again. I'm sorry, I said. My eyes have been troubling me this week. The print is small. Can I keep this for a day or two? I'll sign and bring it to you directly. He took one small breath. I heard it. I was not meant to hear it. Of course, he said, for the second time. Take your time. After he left, I sat in the front room for a long time without moving. The tea had gone cold. The incense had burned down to a small gray cylinder of ash. Outside, a motorbike passed, and then another, and then the street went quiet the way streets in our neighborhood went quiet in the late morning, the brief lull between the rush of the early hours and the heat of noon. I picked up the form and read the reference code again. Then I opened my blue ledger to the page where I had written down the reference number from the compensation agreement at the ward office. The number I had memorized and copied carefully. The number I always wrote in the margin first when beginning a new reconciliation so that I would not lose track of which file I was working with. I placed the two numbers side by side on the page. They were not the same file. I did not know yet what that meant. I did not know what had been done, or when, or how deeply it went. I had one mismatched number, and a feeling in my chest that I recognized from 30 years of accounts, the specific, quiet alarm that sounds when a figure does not reconcile, when something has been moved, and the movement has not been recorded anywhere you were meant to see. I knew this feeling well. I had learned long ago never to ignore it. I closed the ledger. I picked up my phone. I did not call Khan yet. There was more I needed to find before I brought him into this. More I needed to understand before I handed anyone else the incomplete picture. But I wrote the date at the top of a fresh page, and I wrote 3 words underneath it. 2 files open. Then I waited for the thing I could not yet see to come a little closer into the light. I have a method for when something does not add up. I learned it early, in my first year as a junior accountant at the textile factory, from a woman named Mrs. Fung who had been keeping the factory's books since before I was born. She was small and precise and wore the same style of reading glasses for 20 years, and she told me once that the worst thing you could do with a discrepancy was chase it directly. You circle it, she said. You look at everything around it first. You let the numbers on the outside tell you what the number in the middle is hiding. I had circled the mismatched reference code for 2 days before I allowed myself to look at what was in the center. The drawer in Min's desk was the kind that sticks in humid weather. He had meant to fix it for years, kept meaning to plane the wood slightly on the left side where it caught, and had never gotten around to it. After he died, I left it exactly as it was. I don't know why, precisely. Perhaps because the small resistance of the drawer, the way you had to lift and pull at the same time with a particular combination of angle and force, felt like something only I knew how to do now. A small, private thing. Inside were his usual items. Engineering notebooks in varying states of completion. A set of drawing pencils, the good kind, German-made, purchased at a specialty shop near the university 30 years ago, and maintained with the same care he gave everything he considered a real tool. A folder of warranties and manuals for appliances we had owned so long the companies that made them no longer existed. A photograph of Khan at 7 years old, standing in front of the pomelo tree, with a fruit nearly as large as his head, squinting in exactly the way Min squinted, which neither of them ever acknowledged and both of them did. And in the back, behind the engineering notebooks, a thin stack of papers held together with a clip, the color of which I recognized immediately because I had bought that box of clips myself, years ago, from the supply shop near the factory, pale blue. The kind that came 50 to a box and lasted a decade if you were careful. I had not put those papers there. I knew this the way you know things about your own house, with the particular certainty that comes from 40 years of occupying the same space as another person, and learning the grammar of how they organized their world. Min's desk had a logic to it that I understood completely. Engineering materials in the left side, household documents in the right, and in the back of the right drawer, behind everything else, nothing. He kept that space empty. He was particular about empty space, the way some people are particular about clean surfaces. He called it room to think. There was no room to think behind those notebooks anymore. I set the papers on the desk and sat down in his chair. The old wooden one with the arms that had been repaired twice and would probably need a third repair soon. I looked at the stack for a moment before touching it. Outside, a vendor was calling something 2 streets over, the sound arriving thin and fragmented through the afternoon air. A door closed somewhere in the building next door. The incense on the altar had gone out. I removed the blue clip and set it aside and began to read. The document on top was familiar. It was a copy of the original land registration certificate for the house, the one that established Min's family's ownership going back to his parents' generation. I had the original of this, in my own filing cabinet, in the accordion folder where I kept all documents of consequence, organized by category and date, the way I had organized every important paper in my life since I was 26. This copy was unremarkable. I set it aside. The second document was a meeting summary, ward office letterhead, dated 16 months ago, 2 months before Min died. A preliminary consultation regarding the road expansion project and its effect on properties in the affected zone. Min's name was listed as the attending household representative. This I had not known about. He had not told me. I sat with that for a moment. It was possible he had simply forgotten to mention it, or had meant to mention it and then the illness had crowded everything else out. He had been sick by that point, not severely, but present enough that we had both been managing a quiet reorganization of attention, a pulling in toward the essential, away from the peripheral. A meeting at the ward office about a road project that had been planned and delayed for a decade might have seemed peripheral. He might have meant to tell me later, when things were more settled. This was possible. I held it as possible and continued reading. The third document stopped me. It was a single page, ward office format, the type used for official recorded statements. At the top, property owner declaration regarding compensation agreement. In the body, a series of pre-typed statements affirming understanding of the compensation process, agreement to the designated representative arrangement, and acknowledgement of the preliminary compensation figure. The preliminary figure was listed as 480 million dong. This document was dated 11 months ago, 8 months before the official public notification had been posted at the end of the street. The public notification that stated a figure more than double this amount. At the bottom of the page was a signature. It was Min's name, or something that was meant to be Min's name. The characters were correct. The arrangement on the line was how he usually signed documents, slightly left of center, the last stroke of his name pulling upward in the particular way it had since I first saw his signature on our marriage documents. But Min had been dead for 5 months before this document's date. I put the paper down flat on the desk and pressed my hands on either side of it, not touching the signature, just holding the edges of the page. My hands were steady. I noticed this with the observational part of my mind that was always slightly separate, always watching and noting even when the rest of me was occupied with something else. My hands were steady, and my breathing was even, and the room was very quiet, and a dead man had apparently signed a document 8 months after his death. I went through the remaining papers carefully. 3 more pages, smaller, administrative forms cross-referencing the declaration, each one bearing the same reference code, not the one from the official compensation agreement, but the alternate code, the one that had snagged in my attention on the form Hung had placed on my table. A second file. A parallel process. A set of documents running alongside the official one, creating a record of consent that had never happened, establishing a figure that did not match the number the city had posted on the public board for anyone to read. Anyone who read public boards. Anyone who walked past official notices slowly enough to actually read them. I stacked the documents back in order and replaced the blue clip. I put them back in the drawer, behind the engineering notebooks, in exactly the position I had found them. I pressed the drawer closed, lifting and angling it the way you had to, until it caught properly. Then I sat for a long time in my husband's chair and looked at his photograph on the altar. Someone had used his name on a document dated after his death. Someone had created an official record of his agreement to a process he could not have agreed to, establishing a compensation figure less than half of what the city had actually allocated, and had filed it in a second administrative record that existed parallel to the real one, close enough to the original that a person not looking carefully would never notice the difference. I had been an accountant for 30 years. I had spent my career looking for exactly this kind of thing. The parallel record, the shadow ledger, the second set of books that explained where the first set's numbers had gone. I understood now what I was looking at. I understood the shape of it, the structure, the entry and exit points of what had been taken and where it had gone. What I did not yet understand was how far back it reached, how many people had touched these documents, how many hands had moved between my husband's name and the figure on that declaration page. I opened my blue ledger to the next clean sheet. I wrote the date. I wrote the reference code from the documents in the drawer. I wrote the figure. I wrote Minna's name, and beside it, in careful letters, the word impossible. Then I wrote one more thing, a question I did not yet have the answer to, the question that had been sitting at the edge of my mind since I had lifted the papers out of the drawer and seen what was underneath them. If the signature was forged, who in that ward office had accepted it without verifying that the man who signed it was still alive? I underlined the question twice. Then I closed the ledger, and I sat very still, and I listened to the house settle around me in the late afternoon heat, and I thought about who else's name I might find before this was over. I have a rule about conclusions. You do not reach one until you have eliminated every alternative. This was something Mrs. Fung had also taught me, in the same breath as the circling method, because the two principles belong together. Circle the discrepancy, then exhaust every explanation before you decide what it means. A figure that appears wrong is sometimes wrong, but it is sometimes a transcription error, or a revised policy, or a document that applies to a different file, than the one you believe you are reading. You do not accuse a number of lying until you have given it every opportunity to tell the truth. So I gave the signature every opportunity. I spent 3 days with the possibility that I was wrong. Perhaps Min had signed the document before his death, and the date was a clerical error, transposed by a month, a common enough mistake in offices where multiple files moved through the same pair of hands. Perhaps the document had been drafted with a future date, anticipating completion, and the signature had been obtained earlier during one of the ward office's preliminary consultations, the one I had found noted in the meeting summary. Perhaps there was an explanation I had not considered because I was too close to the material, too affected by the sight of his name on a page that should not have held it. I gave the signature 3 days. Then I got on a bus. The Civil Records Office was on a street I had visited twice in my working life, both times for factory-related documentation. It occupied the ground floor of a building that had been several different things over the decades, and retained the slightly confused architectural quality of a space that had never entirely committed to its current purpose. The waiting area had plastic chairs in 2 colors that did not match, and a number dispenser that ran out of paper on the day I arrived, and had to be refilled by a young clerk who seemed surprised this was her responsibility. I took a number and waited. What I was looking for was simple, in the way that simple things sometimes require considerable effort to access. A death is recorded, the date is filed, cross-referenced with the household registration, with the identity document, with the land records attached to the property. In theory, every official transaction touching a deceased person's name after the date of death should flag against that record and require additional documentation to proceed. In theory, I spoke with the clerk for 11 minutes. I explained what I needed, framing it as a routine personal records verification, the kind of thing a widow might do when sorting out her late husband's affairs. This was not untrue. I gave her the relevant identification numbers. She typed for a while, looked at her screen, typed again. What she told me confirmed the first part of what I suspected. Min's death had been properly recorded. The date was correct. The household registration had been updated. Everything on the official civil record was in order. What she could not tell me was whether those records had been checked against the documents filed with the ward office's Land Compensation Division. That, she explained, was a different system, different office, different database. I thanked her. I wrote down the name of the office she directed me to. I went home and I made tea, and I sat at Min's desk with my blue ledger, and I thought for a long time about what it meant that the 2 systems did not automatically speak to each other. It meant that a document bearing a dead man's signature, filed with the Land Compensation Division, would only be questioned if someone specifically cross-referenced it against the civil records. And that cross-referencing would only happen if someone asked, if someone noticed, if someone was looking. They had not expected anyone to look. That was the premise the entire arrangement rested on. An elderly widow, grieving, not particularly engaged with administrative processes, represented by her helpful brother-in-law who had kindly offered to manage everything on her behalf. Who would look? Who would circle the discrepancy and wait for the numbers on the outside to explain the one in the middle? I turned to the back of the blue ledger, to the pages I kept for calculations I was not ready to show anyone. I wrote, "The death record is clean. The compensation file is separate. The signature bypassed the cross-check because no cross-check was triggered. Someone knew the systems did not talk to each other. Someone used that gap deliberately." I underlined deliberately. Then I went to find Batu. She was in her front yard when I arrived, doing what she did most mornings, moving slowly between the clay pots of herbs she kept along the outer wall, checking each one with the focused attention of someone whose primary occupation had become keeping small living things alive. She was 72 and had lived on this street for 45 years, and knew everything about everyone with the comprehensive, unsentimental clarity of a person who had paid attention to her surroundings for half a century. I brought oranges. We sat inside. I asked her about the notification board. She remembered it precisely, as I had expected she would. The board had been put up on a Monday morning, she said, in the 3rd week of the previous month. She remembered because she had gone past it on her way to the market and stopped to read it, as she stopped to read everything posted on that board, which was her habit and had been for years. She had read the full document, because she always read the full document, and she had noted the figures. She had also taken a photograph. On her phone, the small one her daughter had given her, she had taken it because the figures seemed higher than she had expected, higher than what she had heard people in the neighborhood discussing informally, and she had thought she might want to refer to it later. She showed me the photograph. The figure for my property was clear, official, stamped, dated, signed by the District Compensation Committee. 1.15 billion dong. I looked at it on her small screen, the numbers distinct and unambiguous, and I thought about the 480 million in the parallel file in the ward office and about the document in Min's desk with its impossible date. The difference between those two numbers was 670 million dong. I asked Batu if she would send me the photograph. She did, pressing the buttons carefully and with great concentration. The way people do when they trust the technology less than the task. The image arrived on my phone. I saved it in 3 places. I thanked her for the tea and the oranges and walked home slowly, taking the long way, past the notification board, which was empty now, the paper long since taken down, the surface bare. At home, I went to Min's desk and opened the drawer and took out the documents again. I set the parallel declaration beside the photograph on my phone. I looked at both of them for a long time. 670 million dong, missing, redirected, filed away in a secondary record that did not connect to the official one, justified by a signature obtained from a man who had been dead for 5 months when the document was dated. I had the photograph. I had the parallel file. I had the reference code discrepancy in my ledger. I had the civil records confirmation. I had, in the careful and methodical way I had been trained to have things, a complete picture of the discrepancy and a clear accounting of where the money had gone. What I did not have, what I had been turning over in my mind since the afternoon I first opened the drawer, was the piece I could not yet see. The piece that had been bothering me, the way a figure bothers you when the column totals correctly, but the individual line items do not feel right. You can see the bottom line, but something in the middle is still wrong. Hung had arranged the parallel file. Tom had accepted the fraudulent signature. Those were the 2 points I could document. But a document like that, a property owner declaration with a civil record registered individual's name on it, filed in an official ward office system that required more than Hung presenting a piece of paper across a counter. It required someone with access to the filing system to receive it, log it, and mark it as verified. Tom's name was on the meeting summary as the responsible officer. That established his involvement. But when I looked at the parallel declaration again, at the bottom of the page, below the signature line, and above the ward office stamp, there was a second signature field, smaller, labeled, received and verified by. The signature in that field was not Tom's. I had seen Tom's signature earlier in the meeting summary. I had a clear image of it. This signature was different. Different hand. Different style. Different initials. I pulled out my ledger and wrote the initials down carefully. 2 letters. I stared at them. I did not recognize them. But below the initials, in the smallest print on the page, was something I had not noticed before, something I had passed over in my first 2 readings, something so small and routine that it read as furniture rather than content. A staff identification number. I wrote it in the ledger beside the initials. I looked at it for a long time. Then I picked up my phone and called a number I had not dialed in 6 years. A woman I had worked with at the textile factory before she retired, and took a part-time position doing administrative consulting for several small municipal offices in the district. She answered on the 4th ring. I told her I needed a favor. I told her it was important. I told her I had a staff identification number from a ward office document, and I needed to know whose name it belonged to. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Lan, that number format, that's not a ward office number, that's a district level code." I sat very still. Someone above Tom had touched this file. Someone with district-level access and district-level authority had placed their verification on a fraudulent document and filed it in a system designed to process it without question. I asked her how quickly she could find the name. She said she would call me back. I set the phone down on Min's desk and looked at his photograph and understood for the first time that what I had uncovered was not a family matter dressed in bureaucratic clothing. It was the other way around entirely. My friend called back the next morning. Before 7, while the street outside was still in its early state, the motorbikes not yet thickened into their midday density, the air still holding the slight coolness that would burn off by 9. Her name was Hoa, and she had worked beside me in the factory's finance office for 11 years before a knee problem and an early retirement package had redirected her life toward quieter work. She was careful in the way that people who have spent careers handling sensitive information tend to be careful, not secretive, exactly, but precise about what she said, and to whom and in what order. When she called me back that early, I knew she had found something. I also knew, from the deliberate steadiness of her voice, that it had unsettled her. The staff identification number, she said, did not belong to a ward office employee. She had been able to confirm this through a contact she had from her consulting work, a woman who handled document processing for 2 district offices and knew the ID format well enough to identify it on site. District-level codes had a different prefix than ward codes. The number I had given her was district. That much she had already told me. What she had found since then was the name attached to it. She gave it to me. I wrote it in the ledger. Then she said, very quietly, "Lan, this person is in the land management department at the district level. They have oversight authority over the ward offices. They would have access to the compensation files at every stage of processing." I thanked her. I asked her not to mention this conversation to anyone. She said of course, and I knew she meant it, because Hoa was the kind of person who meant things when she said them, which was why I had called her. After I ended the call, I sat for a long time. Tom was the ward officer. The name Hoa had given me was above Tom in the administrative structure, positioned at the district level where oversight of the entire compensation process resided. If someone at that level had placed their verification on a fraudulent document, the document would move through the system without obstruction. It would be received, logged, processed, and filed as legitimate. No flag, no cross-reference, no question. The ward level and the district level working together. Hung providing the access, Tom accepting the document, someone above Tom ensuring it proceeded cleanly through the system. I looked at the name in my ledger. I did not recognize it, which meant nothing. There were many names in district offices I had never needed to know, but the name was there now, in my careful handwriting, on a page that also held 2 reference codes, and a figure and the word impossible, and the column was beginning to total in a way I could read clearly. I needed more than what I had. I had the photograph from Ba 2, the parallel documents from Min's desk, the mismatched reference codes, the civil records confirmation, and now a name. What I did not have was paper that connected these things in a chain someone other than me could follow. I needed the official documents, not copies, originals, or certified versions, or at minimum the kind of official printouts that carried enough institutional weight to be taken seriously by someone with authority to act on them. There was a process for this. Citizens had the right to request documentation related to their own property compensation cases. The process was slow, often intentionally so, and required patience and a tolerance for bureaucratic friction that most people found discouraging. Most people gave up before they received anything useful. I had spent 30 years in a factory finance office. I was not most people. I began with the lowest friction request first. I went to the ward office on a Tuesday, a day I had observed, in my quiet watching of the street's rhythms, was typically less busy than Monday or Thursday. I wore my gray au dai, the one that made me unremarkable, and I carried a simple cloth bag with nothing visible inside it. I brought a small notebook, not the blue ledger, a different one, the kind sold at any stationery shop, and a pen, because I had found over decades that people behaved more carefully when they saw you writing things down. I asked for the public records clerk. There was a public records function in every ward office. Most citizens were unaware of it. I had looked up the relevant regulation the previous week, sitting at Min's desk, cross-referencing the national law on information access with the district's implementation guidelines. I had written down the specific article numbers. The clerk was a young woman who looked surprised to have a visitor at this counter. She asked what I needed. I told her I was requesting a copy of the official compensation notification for my property, the document posted publicly during the 3rd week of the previous month. This was a public document. It had been displayed publicly. I was entitled to a certified copy upon request. She looked uncertain. She said she would need to check. I smiled pleasantly and said I would wait, and I wrote the time in my small notebook. She returned 12 minutes later with a supervisor, a man in his 40s, whose expression arranged itself in the way expressions arrange themselves when someone wants to be obstructive without appearing obstructive. He explained that requests of this nature typically required processing time of 15 to 30 working days. I told him I was familiar with the regulation, and I cited the article number. I mentioned that the processing time for public documents was specified in the implementing guidelines as 5 to 10 working days. I said this without emphasis, without aggression, in the same tone I had used for 30 years when correcting figures in a ledger. Simply, factually, as though the correct information were the only information worth saying aloud. He looked at me for a moment, then he took the young woman aside and spoke to her briefly, and when he came back, his manner had shifted slightly. The way a calculation shifts when a variable is corrected. He told me to fill out a form and return on Friday. I thanked him, filled out the form in careful block letters and left. Outside, I walked to the far end of the street before allowing myself to breathe more slowly, not from fear, from the particular effort of sustained composure, which costs something even when you are practiced at it. My mother used to say that bamboo bends in the wind without breaking, because the roots go down deeper than anyone standing above the ground can see. I had been bending since the morning I found those documents in the drawer. I had been bending carefully and without apparent effort, and every day, the roots had gone a little deeper. I was not ready to stop bending, but I was getting closer to the point where the bending would be done. On Wednesday, I visited Khan's old teacher. This requires some explanation. When Khan was preparing for his engineering entrance examinations, 20 years ago, he had studied with a man named Mr. Kwang, a retired civil engineer who had taught at the Technical University for 30 years before moving to a smaller life in our neighborhood. Mr. Kwang had a son who worked in urban planning at the district level, a fact I had known for years the way you know background facts about people in your circle, without particularly attending to them until they become relevant. I brought oranges, the good kind from the market on Les Loire. I asked about his health, his garden, his son. His son, he said, had recently transferred to a different department within the district office, something to do with infrastructure review. He was still in the building, still familiar with the document flows, but now at a slight remove from the land compensation division. Slight remove, I noted. Not complete remove. I did not ask Mr. Kwang to do anything. I simply mentioned, in the course of our conversation, that I had been navigating the compensation process and finding it unexpectedly complex. I mentioned that I had discovered some inconsistencies in the documentation that I was working to understand. I did not mention names. I did not mention figures. I simply established that there was complexity, and that I was a widow navigating it alone, and that I was doing so methodically. Mr. Kwang listened. He was a careful man, an engineer's man, and he heard what I was not saying as clearly as what I was saying. He told me that if I ever needed someone to look at technical documentation with an experienced eye, his son was a thorough person who took procedural irregularities seriously. I thanked him for the tea and left. I walked home through the afternoon heat, taking the route that went past the empty notification board, and when I reached my gate, I paused with my hand on the latch and looked back down the street the way I sometimes looked at a completed page in the ledger before turning it, taking stock before moving forward. Friday, I would return to the ward office for the certified copy. I also needed to find, before I went further, the answer to a question I had been setting aside because it was the most difficult one. If Hung had produced a document bearing Min's signature 5 months after Min died, someone had created that signature. Hung was not a careful man. He was an ambitious one, which was different. A forged signature required either skill or assistance. I went back to the parallel declaration and looked at it again, this time with a magnifying glass I had taken from Min's desk. The signature was close, very close. It would pass without scrutiny from anyone who had not studied the original repeatedly over 40 years. But beside the signature, in the faintest impression on the paper, as if pressed from another document placed on top during the signing, there was a small additional mark. A partial print, not ink. Pressure. I moved the magnifying glass. I looked at the shape of the mark. It was the corner of a stamp. Not the ward office stamp, which I recognized. A different one, with different edges, and within those edges, the beginning of a character I could not fully make out. I wrote the partial shape in my ledger with the closest approximation I could manage. Then I called Hoa again. I described the mark. I read her the partial character. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Lan, that looks like it could be the corner of a notarial stamp. Not ward level, not district level. That format is from a private notarial office. Someone had used a notary to process or authenticate a forged signature, which meant there was a third location, a third person, and a third set of records that could be found." I sat down at the kitchen table and opened the blue ledger to the next clean page. The column was getting longer, but columns, in my experience, always totaled eventually. I picked up my pen, and I wrote down everything she had said, and I underlined the word notarial 3 times, once for each party I could now name, and once for the one I had not yet found. The certified copy arrived on a Friday, as promised, which surprised me slightly. I had expected another delay. Another reason to return. Another small obstruction placed in the path with the particular casualness of people who have learned that most obstacles do not need to be large to be effective. But the young clerk at the public records counter handed me the envelope with the ward office seal and asked me to sign the receipt log, and I signed it, and I walked out into the afternoon with the document folded carefully inside my cloth bag. I did not open it on the street. I walked home at my usual pace, stopping at the market stall near the corner to buy a bunch of water spinach I did not particularly need, because I had found over the years that the best way to move through a neighborhood without attracting attention was to behave as though you were doing ordinary things. A woman buying vegetables at the end of the week was invisible. She had always been invisible. That had once felt like a limitation. I had learned to understand it as a tool. At home, I set the vegetables on the kitchen counter and opened the envelope at Min's desk. The certified copy was complete. The official compensation notification for all properties in the affected zone, stamped and signed by the District Compensation Committee, dated and numbered. My properties entry was on page 4. The figure was what Batu's photograph had shown, 1.15 billion dong. The official document used the full legal description of the property, the lot number, the registered area in square meters, the compensation rate per square meter, as determined by the current land valuation schedule. I placed it beside the parallel declaration from the drawer. The discrepancy was absolute. There was no interpretation that reconciled the 2 documents, no reading that made them refer to the same transaction. They were 2 different versions of what was owed to me, and only one of them had been created by the city government. I had now, in my possession, the following: the certified official notification, the fraudulent parallel declaration, the reference code discrepancy recorded in my ledger from the beginning, Batu's photograph, the civil records confirmation, the staff identification number with the district-level prefix, and Hoa's information about the partial notarial stamp. What I did not yet have was the notarial office record itself. That was the remaining link, the point where the forgery had been given its veneer of legitimacy, and finding it would require a different approach than the ward office request. Notarial offices were private. They did not respond to citizen record requests the way public offices did. I needed either a legal mechanism or a person. I had been thinking about Mr. Kwang's son. I had not yet made direct contact. I had planted the seed in the conversation with Mr. Kwang and allowed it the appropriate time. You do not rush these things. People who are approached too directly, asked too specifically before the relationship has established its own logic, tend to become cautious in ways that are difficult to reverse. I had seen this in the factory, in the careful dynamics of a workplace where information moved along channels of trust rather than formal structure, and I understood that the same principle applied here. I was preparing to call Mr. Kwang again when Hung arrived. He did not knock. He had not knocked the last time either, but on that occasion I had heard the gate and had a few seconds to compose myself before he appeared at the door. This time the front door simply opened, and he was inside the house, and I had perhaps 2 seconds in which I was aware of the documents on Min's desk, laid out flat and fully visible, before I moved to stand in front of the desk in a way that I hoped appeared natural. He had not come alone. There was a man behind him I had not seen before, older, with the build and expression of someone whose primary professional function was to be present and large. He stayed near the door. He did not speak. Hung looked around the front room with the ease of a man who has decided he is comfortable wherever he stands. He looked at the altar, at Min's photograph, with an expression that was not quite disrespect, and not quite anything else, a blankness that communicated its own meaning. "Sister," he said, "we need to talk about the timeline." I asked him to sit down. He sat, not in the chair I had gestured toward, but in Min's chair, the wooden one by the window. A small thing. An intentional thing. I noted it, and said nothing, and sat across from him. "The ward office tells me you picked up a copy of the public notification," he said. His voice was conversational, pleasant, the voice he used when he wanted to appear unconcerned about something that concerned him. "That's correct," I said. He nodded slowly, as if I had confirmed something he already knew and found mildly interesting. "You know," he said, "those public documents can be confusing. The figures in them don't always reflect the final negotiated amounts. There's an adjustment process. You wouldn't necessarily know that, but it's standard practice." "I see," I said. "The amount in the parallel agreement," he continued, and here he used the word parallel without hesitation, as though it were a normal administrative term and not a description of a fraudulent shadow process, reflects the adjusted figure after accounting for the property's assessed condition and certain outstanding administrative considerations. "Outstanding administrative considerations," I repeated. He smiled. "Paperwork," he said. "You know how it is. Things from years ago that needed to be resolved, nothing for you to worry about." I looked at him. He was 63 years old, and he had sat at family dinners in this house for 4 decades, and eaten the food I had cooked and drunk the tea I had poured, and now he was sitting in my husband's chair telling me not to worry. About paperwork. I asked him what the final timeline was. He leaned back slightly, and the chair made the small creak it always made under Min's weight, and something about that sound in that moment pressed on a place inside my chest that I did not allow to show on my face. "End of the month," he said. "The ward office needs the signature. After that, the funds are released and the whole process is complete." He paused. "Sister, I want to be direct with you. The project team has flagged your property as the only unsigned case. That creates attention. Attention is not good for anyone. It makes people ask questions, and when people ask questions, things slow down. And when things slow down, the terms can be revisited. You understand?" I understood. He was telling me that inquiry was dangerous, that the act of looking would create consequences. He was framing the threat as concern. I told him I needed a few more days. He looked at me for a long moment. The pleasant expression did not leave his face. That was the more unsettling version of Hung, the one that stayed pleasant, because it meant he did not think he needed to change his approach. "Of course," he said. "A few days." He stood. He looked around the front room again, slowly. The way you look at something you are already imagining in a different configuration. His gaze moved across the walls, the furniture, the altar, the windows, the front door dimensions. An engineer's assessment. A buyer's assessment. "It's a good house," he said. "Solid walls. They don't build them this way anymore." He left. The large man who had not spoken followed without looking back. I stood in the front room after the gate closed and listened to the street reassemble its ordinary sounds around the space his visit had left. A motorbike, children's voices from somewhere further up the block, the particular afternoon quality of light coming through the south window, the same light that had fallen through that window since before Khan was born. Then I went to Min's desk and I checked that the documents were exactly as I had left them. They were. He had not gone near the desk. He had not seen what was on it. He had come to apply pressure, to remind me that the clock was running, to stand in my house in my dead husband's chair and tell me that my questions were a liability. What he had not done was appear uncertain. That was the thing I turned over as I put the certified copy into the accordion folder and locked it in the filing cabinet. He had been confident. The specific, slightly bored confidence of a man who does not believe the obstacle in front of him can become anything other than an obstacle. He did not know what I had in the drawer. He did not know about Hoa, or Mr. Kwong, or the notarial stamp, or the ledger with its accumulating column of figures and dates and names. He thought I was what I appeared to be, an old woman with a quiet smile and a few days' worth of hesitation left. I opened my phone and sent a message to Mr. Kwong. Not a call. A message brief and specific. I asked if his son might be available for tea sometime early the following week. I said I had some technical documentation I would appreciate a knowledgeable eye on. I set the phone down and looked at the calendar on Min's desk, the one I still turned each month out of habit. End of the month meant 11 days. 11 days was not very long. But 11 days was also not nothing, and I had never in my professional life failed to complete a reconciliation simply because the deadline was close. The column was almost full. I needed one more line, one more verified figure, and the total would be undeniable. I sat down and opened the blue ledger to the page with the notarial stamp sketch. I looked at the partial character, and I thought about the network of small offices that operated in the district, the notaries who processed property transactions, who stamped and sealed and dated the documents that moved real estate and inheritance and civil matters through official channels. There were not very many of them. And if someone had used a notarial stamp on a fraudulent document, they had either stolen the stamp or had the cooperation of the notary. Either way, there was a record somewhere. There was always a record. I just had not found it yet. Outside, the street was going quiet with the particular early evening quiet of a neighborhood settling into itself before dinner, and I sat at my dead husband's desk in the fading light, with 11 days remaining, and the certain knowledge that somewhere in this city there was one more document with one more name on it, and I was going to find it before the end of the month arrived, and Hung sat across from me again, with that pleasant, confident, unbothered expression on his face. I was going to find it. And then, we would see who had reason to be unbothered. Mr. Kwang's son was named Bin, and he had his father's quality of stillness. He arrived on a Tuesday morning, earlier than I had expected, while the light was still low and the street had not yet committed to its daytime noise. He was perhaps 40, with the careful manner of someone who had spent enough years in administrative work to understand that most problems had paper trails, and most paper trails, if followed correctly, led somewhere definitive. He accepted tea. He sat in the chair by the window, not Min's chair, the other one, and he looked at the documents I placed before him with the focused attention of a person who has been told something important and wants to understand it completely before responding. He did not speak for a long time after he finished reading. When he did, he asked me how long I had been gathering this material. I told him. Several weeks, I said, since I found the documents in the drawer. He nodded. He looked at the parallel declaration again, at the signature that bore Min's name. He looked at it for a long time. Then he said, I know this notarial office. He said it quietly. The way you say something you wish you did not know. The office was on a street in the eastern part of the district, he explained. A small practice that had been operating for about 8 years, handling routine property transactions, inheritance certifications, powers of attorney, standard work. He knew of it because it had come up in an infrastructure review his department had conducted 6 months ago, a review unrelated to land compensation, focused on documentation compliance across various municipal processes. The office had been flagged during that review for a minor procedural irregularity, something that had been noted and not yet pursued, the kind of thing that accumulated in administrative backlogs and waited for someone to have time to follow up. He had not had time. Until now. I asked him what the irregularity was. He said it had to do with the use of a deceased person's identity documents in a property transaction. A different property. A different family. The complaint had been filed by a daughter who discovered, after her mother's death, that a power of attorney bearing her mother's signature had been used to authorize a transaction 6 weeks after the mother died. The same pattern, I said. The same pattern, he confirmed. He looked at me then with the expression of someone doing a calculation they would have preferred not to do, checking the total twice because the first result was one they had not wanted to arrive at. I can access the notarial records through the District Infrastructure Review Authority, he said slowly. It will take a few days. But if the stamp on this document, he touched the edge of the parallel declaration lightly, matches the stamp registered to that office, and if there is a record of this transaction in their log, then you will have a complete chain. Originating document, certifying notary, ward officer, district-level verification, 4 points on a single line. I thanked him. I refilled his tea. He left with the careful, unhurried movement of someone who understood that what he was about to do required precision, and that precision required not being rushed. After the gate closed, I stood in the kitchen for a while, looking at the water spinach I had bought, and still not cooked, sitting in its bowl on the counter. Then I went to the front room and lit a fresh stick of incense at the altar. I did not speak to Min's photograph. I just let the smoke rise. Bing called me on Friday afternoon. His voice was measured in the particular way that voices are measured when the person speaking has found something they did not want to find and is choosing their words with the awareness that each one carries weight. He said he had the notarial records. He said the stamp matched. He said the transaction was logged in the office's records under a client file that had been opened 8 months before Min's death, which was consistent, which was normal, which could have been the legitimate beginning of a legitimate process. And then he said, there is a co-signatory on the notarial file, a second party listed as having been present at the transaction and having provided supporting documentation for the deceased's signature. I already knew before he said it what the name would be. I have thought about this since. About whether I truly knew, or whether I have simply reconstructed the knowing after the fact. The way you sometimes believe you saw something coming that you did not actually see, but I think I did know. I think there was a part of me that had known since the afternoon I found the documents in the drawer and had been building a case strong enough to withstand the knowledge, gathering evidence and structure and documented fact around a center I had not yet been willing to look at directly. Bin said the name. It was Kang, my son. My son's name was on the notarial file as the second party present at the transaction. The one who had provided supporting documentation, the one who had confirmed, in writing, to a notarial officer, that the signature of his deceased father was legitimate. I set the phone on Min's desk and sat down in the wooden chair with the repaired arms. Outside, a vendor called something from the end of the street. A motorbike passed. A door opened and closed. The street continued its ordinary afternoon in the complete indifference to private things that streets have always had. I sat for a very long time. There are things that cannot be absorbed quickly. I have known this since Min died, since the morning of the loosening grip and the open windows, since the weeks after when I had moved through the house in my life. With the slow, underwater quality of someone whose inner equilibrium has been fundamentally disturbed and who has not yet found the new level to settle at. This was different from that. Grief is enormous, but it is clean. It has a recognizable shape. What I felt sitting in that chair in the low afternoon light was not grief in the way I understood grief. It was something more like structural failure. The feeling of a load-bearing element giving way. Of a calculation that had underpinned everything else turning out to have been wrong. Khan had been on the train. That was what I had told myself when Hung first appeared. Khan was busy in Hanoi. I had not wanted to burden him with the administrative complications, had not wanted to pull him away from his work and his life for paperwork that I could handle myself. That was what I had told myself, and it had been true, as far as it went. But it had not been the complete truth. The complete truth was that I had told Khan about the compensation notice when it arrived, because of course I had, he was my son, and I had mentioned that Hung had offered to help manage the process, and Khan had said on the phone, in the easy voice he used when something seemed straightforward, "That makes sense, Ma. Let Uncle Hung handle it. He knows how these things work." I had let him say that. I had not pushed. I had not asked why he was so comfortable with the arrangement, why there was no hesitation in his voice, why a son would encourage his mother to hand over all authority for her own property to a man the son knew his father had never entirely trusted. I had not asked because I had not wanted the answer. Now I had it. I picked up the phone and called Bin back. I asked him how detailed the notarial record was. He told me it included the dates, the parties present, the documentation provided, and a brief transaction summary. I asked him if there was any indication of when Khan had been present, specifically, in relation to when I had learned about the compensation process. He checked. He said the notarial file had been opened originally 8 months before Min's death, as he had mentioned. But the specific entry relating to the supporting documentation for the signature, the entry with Han's name, was dated 4 weeks after Min died. 8 weeks before I had learned about the compensation notification at all. 4 weeks after the funeral. While I had been sitting in this house with the windows open and the incense burning and the accumulated weight of 40 years of shared life pressing on every surface of every room, My son had been in a notarial office in the Eastern District, providing documentation to support a forged signature bearing his dead father's name. I did not cry. I want to be clear about that, not because I think it is admirable, but because it is true, and the truth of this story requires that I describe things as they were. I did not cry. I sat in the chair, and I breathed and I looked at Min's photograph on the shelf, at his face at 53, and I felt something that I do not have a word for in any language, something that was grief and rage and a kind of absolute, bottomless sorrow for the version of my son that I had believed in, the one who had learned to walk gripping the altar bench, the one who had squinted in photographs like his father, the one I had raised to understand that numbers did not lie, and people should not either. Ben was still on the line. I thanked him. I told him I would need the documentation in a form that could be submitted to the district inspector's office. I told him I would be filing a formal complaint. I told him that the complaint would name every party in the chain. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he would prepare everything I needed and have it ready by the end of the following week. I ended the call. I opened the blue ledger to the page with a column of figures and names. At the bottom, below Hung, below Tom, below the district-level officer, I wrote one more name. My son's name. I wrote it in the same careful handwriting I had used for every other entry, with the same pen, on the same narrow-ruled page. I did not press harder than necessary. I did not allow my hand to tremble. Then I closed the ledger, and I placed it in the drawer where Min's documents had been, and I sat with my hands flat on the desk surface, and the evening coming down over the street outside, and the incense ash on the altar curling in on itself, and I understood that the thing I had been building toward all these weeks was not the ending I had imagined when I began. It was harder than that. It was going to cost more than I had calculated, and I was going to do it anyway. I have always believed that the most important work happens in the quiet before anything visible occurs. This is something I understood from accounting before I understood it from life. The actual entry in the ledger, the moment the figure is written and the column totals, that is not where the work is. The work is in the verification, the cross-referencing, the patient accumulation of supporting evidence that makes the final entry unassailable. Anyone can write a number. What matters is whether the number can be defended from every angle, whether every document that should exist does exist, whether the chain of evidence holds under pressure from any direction a challenge might come from. I spent 3 days after binge call not doing anything visible. I went to the market in the mornings. I tended the pomelo tree. I changed the water in the offering bowl on the altar. I cooked rice and ate it at the kitchen table and washed the bowl afterward and put it back in the cabinet. From the outside, I was an old woman moving through the ordinary rhythms of her days, unremarkable, settled, the kind of person whose stillness is mistaken for inactivity. Inside, I was building the case. The first thing I did was write out everything I had, organized by source and date, in the clear columnar format I had used for 30 years in the factory. Not in the blue ledger, which was my working document, my notes and observations and the running record of what I had found and when. I wrote it in a separate notebook, the brown one I kept for final documentation, the one I used when I was preparing something to be read by someone other than myself. I wrote it plainly, without commentary, in the format of a financial audit report because that was the format I knew and trusted and could defend. Source 1. Official District Compensation Notification, Certified Copy, Ward Office Public Records, Date of Issue, and Date of my receipt, both noted, figure stated, square meter calculation included, and verified against the registered property area. Source 2. Parallel Declaration Document, recovered from deceased husband's personal desk, date of document noted, discrepancy from official notification calculated and stated. Signature analysis notation included with reference to the civil death record confirming the signatory's date of death relative to the document date. Source 3. Civil records confirmation. Details of the registry cross-check, confirming that no cross-reference between the death record and the compensation file had been triggered, noting the administrative gap that had allowed the parallel document to proceed unquestioned. Source 4. Batu's photograph of the public notification board, date the photograph was taken. Relationship of witness to the property and the street, contact information noted. Source 5. Reference code discrepancy. Both codes recorded in full, Discrepancy identified. Explanation of what the differing codes indicated about the parallel file structure. Source 6. Staff identification number. Format analysis, confirming district. Level origin. Name of the officer obtained through the administrative consulting contact, position, and department noted. Source 7. Notarial office records. Obtained through the District Infrastructure Review Authority. Stamp match confirmed. Transaction log entry date. Names of parties present. Supporting documentation provided. All is recorded in the official notarial file. I wrote each source heading in clean letters, the information beneath it in organized subpoints, with cross-references to supporting documents noted in the margin. When I finished, I read it through twice, checking for gaps, for places where the chain had a link missing or a connection that required an inferential step rather than documentary proof. There were 2 places where the chain was inferential rather than documented. I noted them honestly, the way you note a figure that is an estimate rather than a confirmed total, with a clear indication of what additional evidence would be needed to make it definitive. One of those places was the mechanism by which the district-level officer had verified the parallel document. I had the name. I had the ID number on the document. What I did not have was a record of communication between that officer and either Hung or Tom, something that established coordination rather than mere coincidence of involvement. This was the kind of evidence that could be obtained through an official investigation with subpoena authority, not through the means available to a private citizen requesting public records. I noted it as a gap to be addressed by the inspector's office. The other inferential place was Khan. I sat with his entry in the brown notebook for a long time before I wrote it. I had the notarial record showing his name as the second party. I had the date, which placed him in that office 4 weeks after Min's death, and 8 weeks before I knew about the compensation process at all. What I did not have, what I could not document from the outside, was what he had known and when he had known it, whether he had understood what he was signing, or whether Hung had presented it to him in some form that obscured its meaning, or whether he had known precisely what he was doing and had done it anyway. I did not know which of those was true. I was not certain I wanted to know before the inspector's office looked into it, because what I needed from this process was not a verdict on my son's intentions. What I needed was an investigation that would produce answers from evidence rather than from my own grief-compromised assessment of the son I thought I had raised. I wrote his entry, plainly, factually, with the same format as every other source. Then I moved on. I called Marcus, the civil attorney I had used for property matters when Min was still alive. Not Marcus Torres from a different life and a different country, but a man I had known for 20 years who had handled the registration of the house and the inheritance documentation after Min's death. His name was Mr. Thung, and he had the particular quality of a lawyer who had been practicing long enough to be unshockable, who heard whatever you told him and filed it in a professional context rather than a personal one, and proceeded from there. I told him what I had. I described the documentation without reading it aloud, giving him the summary in the same structured format I had written it. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things I appreciated about him. When I finished, he was quiet for approximately 4 seconds. Then he said, "You'll need to file with the district inspector's office, not the ward level. The ward office is implicated. You need to go above them." "I know," I said. "I wanted to make sure my documentation is complete before I file." He said it sounded complete to him. He said he would accompany me to the filing, if I wanted, to ensure the submission was accepted and logged formally rather than routed to a review process that could delay it indefinitely. I said yes. He said, "Lon, this is going to involve your son's name." I said I was aware. Another pause. Then, "Do you want to speak with him first, before you file?" I had thought about this. I had thought about it on each of the 3 quiet days while I was building the brown notebook, while I was sitting at the kitchen table eating rice by myself, and listening to the pomelo tree move in the evening wind, whether to call Han, whether to give him the chance to explain, or to confess, or to say something that would change the shape of what I understood to have happened. I had decided not to. Not yet. Not because I did not want to hear him, because I was not yet in a position where I could hear him without it affecting the clarity of what I was about to do. The documentation was built on facts, not on interpretations. not on mitigating circumstances that I might or might not be equipped to evaluate fairly, given that this was my child we were discussing, and I was not a judge. I was a mother and a widow, and a woman who had found her dead husband's forged name in a file designed to steal what was owed to her. After the filing, I told Mr. Thung, "After the inspector has the case, then I will speak to Khan." He said he understood. He said to call him when I was ready and he would arrange the appointment. I had one more thing to prepare. In the accordion folder in the filing cabinet, behind the certified copy of the compensation notification and in front of the property registration documents, I placed the parallel declaration in a clear plastic sleeve. Beside it I placed a single page, handwritten, listing the document's provenance, where I had found it, when, what I had observed about its content, and how it related to the other materials in the folder. I signed and dated the page. I attached a copy of the death certificate and a copy of the civil records confirmation, and a printed copy of the relevant regulation governing property compensation notifications with the applicable sections underlined in pencil. Then I closed the accordion folder and locked the filing cabinet and put the key on the chain with my house key where it had always lived. I looked at the clock on the kitchen wall. It was a few minutes past 8 in the evening. Outside, the street had gone to its night sounds, softer and more spread apart than the daytime, punctuated by the occasional motorbike and the low conversation of neighbors sitting outside in the cooling air. The end of the month was in 6 days. I had filed nothing yet. I had made no move that anyone watching would recognize as a move. Hung did not know what was in the brown notebook. He did not know about Bin, or about Mr. Thung, or about the photograph from Batu now organized in a labeled sleeve in the accordion folder. He did not know that the column in the blue ledger was complete, that every figure had a corresponding document, that the chain of evidence ran without interruption from the first mismatched reference code to the name on the notarial log. He thought he was waiting for an old woman to run out of days. He was right that the days were running out. He was wrong about everything else. I turned off the kitchen light and went to stand for a moment at the altar in the dark, in front of Min's photograph, before I went to bed. I told him I was ready. Tomorrow, I would call Mr. Thung and set the appointment. The quiet before the storm was over. The district inspector's office occupied the 3rd floor of a building that smelled of floor wax and old paper, and the particular institutional stillness of a place where consequential things happened slowly and without drama. Mr. Thung had arranged the appointment for a Tuesday morning, 10 o'clock, formal complaint submission with all supporting documentation. He had told me to dress as I normally dressed, to bring nothing more than what was needed, to let the documents speak. I wore my dark blue auzai, the one I had worn to Min's funeral, and before that to Khan's engineering graduation, and before that to the ceremony when I was promoted to chief accountant at the textile factory. It was the garment I wore when I needed to be clearly, unmistakably myself. I carried Min's old briefcase, brown leather, brass clasps, worn smooth at the corners from decades of use. He had carried it to every significant meeting of his professional life. I had carried it to the ward office on the morning of the failed first meeting. I carried it now because it held the accordion folder, and the accordion folder held everything, and I wanted the weight of it in my hand when I walked through that door. Mr. Thung met me in the lobby. He looked at the briefcase and nodded once, and we went upstairs. What I had not told Mr. Thung, what I had not told anyone, was that I had made one additional call the previous evening. I had called Hung. I had told him, in a mild and unremarkable voice, that I was ready to sign the compensation agreement. I had told him I wanted to meet at the ward office at 11 o'clock on Tuesday morning to complete the paperwork. I had told him to bring Tum, so that everything could be processed in one visit. He had been so pleased he had not questioned any of it. The inspector's office was a room with a long table and 4 chairs and a window that looked out over the district's main commercial street. The inspector was a woman named Mrs. Lone, perhaps 55, with the close attention of someone who had spent her career reading documents that were designed to obscure rather than reveal. She had reviewed the summary Mr. Thung had sent in advance. She had the brown notebook open in front of her when we sat down. I placed the accordion folder on the table and opened it. I had arranged the documents in submission order, the order that built the case, the way a column builds from its first entry to its total. I talked through each one, not quickly, not with emotion, in the same measured cadence I had used at the factory when presenting year-end reconciliation reports to the director's office. Here is the figure. Here is its source. Here is how it relates to this figure, and to this document, and to this discrepancy. And here is what that discrepancy means when you follow it to its conclusion. Mrs. Lone read each document as I placed it before her. She made notes. She did not interrupt. When I reached the parallel declaration with Min's signature and the civil death record showing his date of death, she stopped writing and looked at the two documents side by side for a long moment. Then she looked at me. I said nothing. I let the documents say it. She wrote something in her notes. She turned to the next item. When I finished, the table held 12 organized documents, each in its labeled plastic sleeve, each cross-referenced to the corresponding entry in the brown notebook. Mr. Thung had brought a second copy of the full package, certified, for the inspector's records. Mrs. Lone closed the brown notebook and sat back slightly. She said, "This is among the most thoroughly documented complaints I have received in 14 years in this office." Mr. Thung said nothing. He had advised me that compliments from inspectors were not invitations to speak. She said she would be opening a formal investigation immediately. She said she had authority to freeze the compensation disbursement pending investigation. She said the ward office would be notified of the investigation through official channels, which meant that the notification would arrive without warning, and that anyone expecting routine Tuesday morning business at that office was about to receive something other than what they anticipated. I thanked her. I stood. I picked up Min's briefcase. Then I went to meet Hung. The ward office conference room was smaller than the district inspector's, with a table that seated 6 and a window that faced the interior courtyard. Hung was already there when I arrived at 11, sitting with Tom across the table from 2 empty chairs, the compensation agreement spread between them, a pen set beside it with the deliberate placement of someone who has prepared a stage. Batu sat in the corner. I had asked her to come as my witness, as she had come before. She had her small hands folded in her lap and her expression of alert attention, the expression of a woman who had watched this street for 45 years and missed very little. I set the briefcase on the table. I sat down. I did not pick up the pen. Hung's expression was the pleasant one, the one he wore when he believed the outcome was already settled. Tom had his folder open, his own pen ready. The room smelled of cigarette smoke and the specific staleness of government furniture. "So, sister," Hung said, using the word with the particular warmth that masks condescension, "ready to put this behind us?" I looked at him. I thought about that first morning at this table, months ago now, when he had set the initial figures in front of me and explained with practiced ease that the amounts in the parallel agreement reflected adjusted figures after accounting for outstanding administrative considerations. I thought about the way he had said, "Sign here, sister, and be grateful we're giving you anything at all." The voice he had used, the face he had made, the absolute certainty that she would not know, that she never understood money, that 30 years of numbers added up to nothing in the hands of an old woman who had let herself be managed. I thought about Min, who had watched his brother for 40 years with the quiet assessment of a man who understood what he was looking at and chose, for the sake of family and peace, to say very little about it. I thought about what it had cost him to say very little. I reached into the briefcase. I did not take out the compensation agreement. I took out a single sheet of paper, which I placed on the table facing Hung and Tom. It was a copy of the district inspector's formal investigation notice, stamped and signed by Mrs. Lone, time-stamped at 10:43 that morning, 47 minutes ago. Hung looked at it. His face did the thing faces do when a calculation that seems straightforward reveals an error that invalidates everything that followed from it. The rearrangement was not dramatic. It was quiet, the way structural failure is quiet until it isn't. The color left his face in the particular order that blood leaves faces when the body understands something before the mind does. Tom reached for the paper and then stopped, his hand suspended halfway across the table, as if touching it might make it more real than it already was. "I have filed a formal complaint with the district inspector's office," I said. "The complaint includes the certified compensation notification, showing the correct figure of 1.15 billion dong, the parallel declaration bearing my late husband's signature dated 5 months after his death, the reference code discrepancy establishing the existence of a shadow file, the notarial records confirming the transaction log, and the parties present, the civil death record, the staff identification number of the district-level officer who verified the fraudulent document, and Batu's photographic record of the public notification. I paused. The disbursement has been frozen pending investigation. Hung's mouth opened. No sound came. Tom stood up. His chair scraped back and he stood there, and then sat back down, because there was nowhere to go, no direction in which standing would improve his situation. And the room was very small, and the investigation notice was on the table, and the woman across from him had just listed, from memory, in the order she had documented them, every element of a case that had taken months to build and approximately 12 minutes to deliver. I looked at Hung directly. "You told me," I said quietly, "that I never understood money. That I was in the back room counting other people's numbers. You told me to sign and be grateful." He said nothing. I folded my hands on the table, on top of Min's briefcase, and I let the silence sit. "I have been counting numbers for 30 years, I said. "The ones in your file and the ones in mine. They are not the same numbers. They have never been the same numbers. And now the district inspector has both sets, and she is considerably better positioned than you to determine what that difference means." Batu, in her corner chair, was watching with the careful stillness of someone filing everything she witnessed in a place she would not forget. Hung found his voice. It was smaller than usual, the voice of a man in a room where all the air has changed. "Sister," he said, "we can discuss this. There may have been errors, administrative issues, things that can be clarified without involving." "The inspector is already involved," I said. "That is not a door that can be closed." He looked at the notice again. He looked at Tom, who was looking at the table. He looked at me. For the first time in the months since this had begun, I saw something in his face that had not been there before. Not anger, not calculation. Not the pleasant mask of a man who believed he was managing an old woman with limited options. He saw me. For the first time, sitting in that small room with the investigation notice between us, and everything he had built dissolving into its actual components, he looked at me and understood that he had been looking at the wrong person all along. I picked up the briefcase and stood. "I will not be signing anything today," I said, and I walked out of that room and into the corridor, and through the front door of the ward office, into the ordinary morning street, with the fruit sellers and the motorbikes and the light falling clean and even over everything. Batu came out behind me a moment later. She said nothing. She walked beside me in the direction of home, her small hands folded in front of her, her pace steady. Presently she said, "You knew, didn't you, before you went in? You knew exactly what would happen." "Yes," I said. She was quiet for half a block. Then she said, the look on his face. "Yes," I said. We walked the rest of the way home without speaking, which was its own kind of satisfaction, the kind that does not need to be said aloud to be completely real. The district inspector's office occupied the third floor of a building that smelled of floor wax and old paper, and the particular institutional stillness of a place where consequential things happened slowly and without drama. Mr. Thung had arranged the appointment for a Tuesday morning, 10 o'clock, formal complaint submission with all supporting documentation. He had told me to dress as I normally dressed, to bring nothing more than what was needed, to let the documents speak. I wore my dark blue áo, the one I had worn to Min's funeral, and before that to Khan's engineering graduation, and before that to the ceremony when I was promoted to chief accountant at the textile factory. It was the garment I wore when I needed to be clearly, unmistakably myself. I carried Min's old briefcase, brown leather, brass clasps, worn smooth at the corners from decades of use. He had carried it to every significant meeting of his professional life. I had carried it to the ward office on the morning of the failed first meeting. I carried it now because it held the accordion folder, and the accordion folder held everything, and I wanted the weight of it in my hand when I walked through that door. Mr. Thung met me in the lobby. He looked at the briefcase and nodded once, and we went upstairs. What I had not told Mr. Thung, what I had not told anyone, was that I had made one additional call the previous evening. I had called Hung. I had told him, in a mild and unremarkable voice, that I was ready to sign the compensation agreement. I had told him I wanted to meet at the ward office at 11 o'clock on Tuesday morning to complete the paperwork. I had told him to bring Tom, so that everything could be processed in one visit. He had been so pleased, he had not questioned any of it. The inspector's office was a room with a long table and 4 chairs and a window that looked out over the district's main commercial street. The inspector was a woman named Mrs. Lone, perhaps 55, with the close attention of someone who had spent her career reading documents that were designed to obscure rather than reveal. She had reviewed the summary Mr. Thung had sent in advance. She had the brown notebook open in front of her when we sat down. I placed the accordion folder on the table and opened it. I had arranged the documents in submission order. The order that built the case the way a column builds from its first entry to its total. I talked through each one, not quickly, not with emotion, in the same measured cadence I had used at the factory when presenting year-end reconciliation reports to the director's office. Here is the figure, here is its source, here is how it relates to this figure, and to this document, and to this discrepancy, and here is what that discrepancy means when you follow it to its conclusion. Mrs. Lone read each document as I placed it before her. She made notes. She did not interrupt. When I reached the parallel declaration with Min's signature and the civil death record showing his date of death, she stopped writing and looked at the 2 documents side by side for a long moment. Then she looked at me. I said nothing. I let the documents say it. She wrote something in her notes. She turned to the next item. When I finished, the table held 12 organized documents, each in its labeled plastic sleeve, each cross-referenced to the corresponding entry in the brown notebook. Mr. Thung had brought a second copy of the full package, certified, for the inspector's records. Mrs. Lone closed the brown notebook and sat back slightly. She said, "This is among the most thoroughly documented complaints I have received in 14 years in this office." Mr. Thung said nothing. He had advised me that compliments from inspectors were not invitations to speak. She said she would be opening a formal investigation immediately. She said she had authority to freeze the compensation disbursement pending investigation. She said the ward office would be notified of the investigation through official channels, which meant that the notification would arrive without warning, and that anyone expecting routine Tuesday morning business at that office was about to receive something other than what they anticipated. I thanked her. I stood. I picked up Min's briefcase. Then I went to meet Hung. The ward office conference room was smaller than the district inspector's, with a table that seated 6 and a window that faced the interior courtyard. Hung was already there when I arrived at 11, sitting with Tom across the table from 2 empty chairs, the compensation agreement spread between them, a pen set beside it with the deliberate placement of someone who has prepared a stage. Batu sat in the corner. I had asked her to come as my witness, as she had come before. She had her small hands folded in her lap, and her expression of alert attention, the expression of a woman who had watched this street for 45 years and missed very little. I set the briefcase on the table. I sat down. I did not pick up the pen. Hung's expression was the pleasant one, the one he wore when he believed the outcome was already settled. Tom had his folder open, his own pen ready. The room smelled of cigarette smoke and the specific staleness of government furniture. "So, sister," Hung said, using the word with the particular warmth that masks condescension. "Ready to put this behind us?" I looked at him. I thought about that first morning at this table, months ago now, when he had set the initial figures in front of me and explained with practiced ease that the amounts in the parallel agreement reflected adjusted figures after accounting for outstanding administrative considerations. I thought about the way he had said, "Sign here, sister, and be grateful we're giving you anything at all," the voice he had used, the face he had made, the absolute certainty that she would not know, that she never understood money, that 30 years of numbers added up to nothing in the hands of an old woman who had let herself be managed. I thought about Min, who had watched his brother for 40 years with the quiet assessment of a man who understood what he was looking at and chose, for the sake of family and peace, to say very little about it. I thought about what it had cost him to say very little. I reached into the briefcase. I did not take out the compensation agreement. I took out a single sheet of paper, which I placed on the table facing Hung and Tom. It was a copy of the district inspector's formal investigation notice, stamped and signed by Mrs. Lone, time-stamped at 10:43 that morning. 47 minutes ago. Hung looked at it. His face did the thing faces do when a calculation that seemed straightforward reveals an error that invalidates everything that followed from it. The rearrangement was not dramatic. It was quiet, the way structural failure is quiet until it isn't. The color left his face in the particular order that blood leaves faces when the body understands something before the mind does. Tom reached for the paper and then stopped, his hand suspended halfway across the table, as if touching it might make it more real than it already was. "I have filed a formal complaint with the district inspector's office," I said. The complaint includes the certified compensation notification showing the correct figure of 1.15 billion dong, the parallel declaration bearing my late husband's signature dated 5 months after his death, the reference code discrepancy establishing the existence of a shadow file, the notarial records confirming the transaction log and the parties present, the civil death record, the staff identification number of the district-level officer who verified the fraudulent document, and Ba2's photographic record of the public notification. I paused. "The disbursement has been frozen pending investigation." Hung's mouth opened. No sound came. Tom stood up. His chair scraped back, and he stood there, and then sat back down, because there was nowhere to go, no direction in which standing would improve his situation, and the room was very small, and the investigation notice was on the table, and the woman across from him had just listed, from memory, in the order she had documented them, every element of a case that had taken months to build and approximately 12 minutes to deliver. I looked at Hung directly. "You told me," I said quietly, "that I never understood money. That I was in the back room counting other people's numbers. You told me to sign and be grateful." He said nothing. I folded my hands on the table, on top of Min's briefcase, and I let the silence sit. "I have been counting numbers for 30 years, I said, "the ones in your file and the ones in mine. They are not the same numbers. They have never been the same numbers. And now the district inspector has both sets, and she is considerably better positioned than you to determine what that difference means." Ba2, in her corner chair, was watching with the careful stillness of someone filing everything she witnessed in a place she would not forget. Hung found his voice. It was smaller than usual, the voice of a man in a room where all the air has changed. "Sister," he said, "we can discuss this. There may have been errors, administrative issues, things that can be clarified without involving." "The inspector is already involved," I said. "That is not a door that can be closed." He looked at the notice again. He looked at Tom, who was looking at the table. He looked at me. For the first time in the months since this had begun, I saw something in his face that had not been there before. Not anger, not calculation, not the pleasant mask of a man who believed he was managing an old woman with limited options. He saw me. For the first time, sitting in that small room with the investigation notice between us and everything he had built dissolving into its actual components, he looked at me and understood that he had been looking at the wrong person all along. I picked up the briefcase and stood. "I will not be signing anything today," I said. And I walked out of that room and into the corridor, and through the front door of the ward office, into the ordinary morning street, with the fruit sellers and the motorbikes and the light falling clean and even over everything. Ba2 came out behind me a moment later. She said nothing. She walked beside me in the direction of home, her small hands folded in front of her, her pace steady. Presently she said, "You knew, didn't you? Before you went in. You knew exactly what would happen." "Yes," I said. She was quiet for half a block. Then she said, the look on his face. "Yes," I said. We walked the rest of the way home without speaking, which was its own kind of satisfaction, the kind that does not need to be said aloud to be completely real. The investigation moved the way official things move when the people conducting them understand what they are looking at and have decided to take it seriously. Not quickly, but with the particular inevitability of a process that has been correctly initiated and properly documented and handed to people with both the authority and the inclination to follow it through. Mrs. Lone called Mr. Thung on the Thursday after my ward office visit. He relayed the summary to me that evening. Sitting in my kitchen with tea he did not drink while he told me what the inspector's office had found in the first 72 hours of their inquiry. They had frozen the compensation disbursement for the entire project, not only my property. This was standard procedure when fraud was suspected in a compensation file, he explained. because the presence of one fraudulent parallel document raised the probability that others existed. 12 properties in the affected zone, 12 files. The inspector's office was reviewing all of them. I had not anticipated that. I had built my case around my own property, my own documents, my own column of figures. It had not occurred to me, or rather it had occurred to me and I had set it aside as beyond the scope of what I could establish, that Hung and Tom and the district officer whose name I had written in my ledger might have done this before, might have done it to others, might have been doing it systematically across projects in the district, case by case, file by file, family by family, old women and widows and people who trusted their brother-in-law to handle the paperwork because grief is disorienting and administrative processes are designed to be difficult, and most people do not know that the figures in the parallel agreement are not the figures on the public notification board. Most people do not read public notification boards. I sat with that for a long time after Mr. Thung left. Hung called me the following morning. Once, at 7:45, before I had finished my tea. I looked at his name on the screen and let it ring. He called again at 9. I was at Min's desk, reviewing a copy of the procedural timeline Mr. Thung had prepared, and I let it ring again. At 11, a car stopped in front of my gate. Not Hung. A man I did not recognize, perhaps 35. With the look of someone who has been sent to do something he would prefer not to be doing. He knocked. I opened the door. He said he was a colleague of Hung's, and that Hung wanted to meet, at a location of my choosing, at my convenience, to discuss the situation and see if there was a way to resolve things privately before the investigation proceeded further. I told him to tell Hung that the investigation was not mine to stop. The man nodded with the expression of someone who had expected this answer and was going to have an unpleasant conversation when he reported it. He left. I closed the gate and went back to Min's desk, and I noticed that my hands were steady and my breathing was even, and the morning light in the study was the same morning light it had always been, falling through the same window at the same angle, and everything about the room was exactly as it had been before Hung's name appeared on my phone screen, because some things do not change when you have decided what you are doing and why. The collapse, when it came from Tom. Mr. Thung told me this on the following Tuesday. Tom had contacted the inspector's office independently, without a lawyer, which was the first sign that he was more frightened than strategic. He had provided a voluntary statement. In the statement, he had described his role as that of a facilitated intermediary, his word, meaning that he had received the parallel documents, processed them through the ward office system, and applied the ward-level stamp without conducting the verification cross-check that protocol required. He had not, he said, created the documents. He had not forged the signature. He had not initiated the scheme. He had been approached by the district-level officer whose name I had written in my ledger, a man named Mr. Duck, who had explained that the parallel documentation was a legitimate administrative adjustment process used for cases involving complex ownership histories, and that the ward office's role was simply to receive and process without additional review. Tom had believed him, or had chosen to believe him, which was not quite the same thing, but was the version Tom had decided to present. Mr. Thung said that Tom's statement had implicated Mr. Duck directly. Mr. Duck had, upon learning of Tom's voluntary statement, retained a lawyer and declined to speak further to the inspector's office. His silence, in the context of Tom's statement and the documentary evidence already on file, had the quality of a figure that has been circled and can no longer be explained away. And Hung, I asked. Hung had also retained a lawyer, Mr. Thung said. His lawyer had sent a letter to the inspector's office suggesting that the parallel documentation had been prepared in good faith based on advice received from ward office and district-level officials, and that Hung had acted as a family representative without understanding that the documentation he had provided was procedurally irregular. I looked at Mr. Thung. He looked at me. He is saying he did not know the signature was forged, I said. That appears to be his position, Mr. Thung said, in the careful tone of a lawyer describing a legal strategy without endorsing it. I thought about the document with Min's name on it. I thought about the date, 5 months after the funeral, and the notarial office on the Eastern Street, and the co-signatory entry with Khan's name on it. I thought about what it would require for a man to bring a document bearing his dead brother's signature to a notarial office and represent it as valid, and to do so 4 weeks after sitting at the funeral and watching the incense burn, and to do so while continuing to come to this house with oranges and reasonable voices and the comfortable ease of a man who had decided what he was going to do and simply needed everyone around him to not look too carefully. I did not say any of this to Mr. Thung. What I said was, "The notarial record shows the date. The civil death record shows the date. The gap is 5 months. His lawyer is welcome to explain it." Mr. Thung said he had relayed exactly this to the inspector's office, with the documentary evidence attached. 3 weeks after the investigation opened, the inspector's office issued its preliminary findings. Mr. Thung brought the document to my kitchen table on a Wednesday afternoon when the light through the south window was doing what it did in the early autumn, going golden and slightly sideways in the way that always reminded me that the year was turning. He set the document in front of me and let me read it. The preliminary findings identified 4 fraudulent parallel compensation files across the 12 properties in the affected zone. Mine was among them. The combined discrepancy across the 4 cases totaled more than 2.3 billion dong. The investigation named 3 parties for formal referral to the Criminal Prosecution Division, Hung, for submission of fraudulent documentation and misrepresentation in a civil compensation process. Mr. Duk, the district-level officer, for abuse of administrative authority and verification of fraudulent documents. The notarial officer who had processed the forged signature, a man I had never met, whose stamp was on the document in the drawer. Tom was named as a cooperating witness. His case was referred to the Administrative Discipline Division rather than criminal prosecution. He would lose his position. He would not, under the preliminary determination, face criminal charges. I read the document through twice. I noted the figures. I noted the names. I noted the legal references and the procedural timeline the investigation had followed and the specific evidence cited in each finding. 4 families, I said. Yes, Mr. Thung said. 4 families who signed because they trusted the process, because they trusted the person who told them to sign. He nodded. I thought about the woman who had filed the earlier complaint about her mother's power of attorney, the one Bin had mentioned during his initial call, the case that had been flagged in the infrastructure review and left sitting in an administrative backlog waiting for someone to have time to follow up. I thought about how long that case had been waiting. I thought about what Hung had said, in the first meeting at the ward office, with the warm voice and the reasonable manner. "You never understood money anyway. That's why your husband kept you in the back room counting other people's numbers." He had believed that. He had looked at me across that table and believed it completely. The way you believe something when all the evidence available to you confirms it, when you have never been given reason to think otherwise. An old woman. A widow. A woman who had spent her career in the back room, working with figures that belonged to someone else's business, who would not know the difference between a public notification and a shadow file, who would not read the board at the end of the street, who would not recognize a mismatched reference code, who would not keep a blue ledger with a running column of everything she had seen and heard and documented since the first morning. She noticed that the numbers did not add up. He had never been given reason to think otherwise because I had given him none. That had been a choice. It had felt, in the difficult weeks of its execution, like a limitation. An old woman, quiet, unremarkable, moving through her ordinary days, while the case built itself in the notebooks on Min's desk. Sitting at my kitchen table with the preliminary findings in front of me and Mr. Thung across from me and the autumn light coming gold through the south window, I understood it had been the whole point. "The back room," I said, "is where the books are kept." Mr. Thung looked at me. "That is where you find out what the numbers actually say," I said. "It has always been the most important room in the building." Hung never understood that. Mr. Thung was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What would you like to do about Khan?" I looked at the table. I looked at Min's briefcase, sitting beside the filing cabinet where I had set it when I came home from the ward office 2 weeks ago. "Call him," I said. "Tell him to come home. There are things that cannot be settled across phone lines or through lawyers or by any process that keeps people at a distance from each other. There are conversations that require 2 people in the same room, with the same air between them, with nothing mediated by paperwork or professional representation. I was not ready for that conversation. I did not know if I would ever be fully ready. But I had learned, in the months since I found those documents in the drawer, that readiness is a condition you grow into by beginning, not by waiting. You do not wait until the column is complete before you start entering figures. You begin with the first figure you have, and you add to it, and eventually you arrive at the total, and you deal with what the total says. Khan needed to come home. The rest I would work out when he got here. There are people in this world who have spent their whole lives being the quiet ones, the ones who kept the books, raised the children, tended the home, and asked for nothing in return. The ones who were looked past, spoken over, written off as too old, too tired, too simple to understand. But silence was never weakness, and patience was never surrender. Some people have been keeping count all along, in ways no one thought to look for. If this story moved you, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. New stories like this one are waiting for you, and we don't want you to miss them. Now we want to hear from you. If you were in Lan's place, would you have done the same thing, or would you have chosen a different path?